Alright, welcome back, y'all. Today we're going to talk about cognitive warfare. So I've been wanting to talk about this for a while. Again, this is one of those pretty taboo subjects in a way. People generally don't want to talk about it, and it hasn't really reached a point of definitiveness in the discipline, or the sort of developing discipline, I guess, that studies the topic. They don't fully know how to define it yet, as we'll see in a moment here. So it's kind of a difficult thing to talk about in that way. So I'll give people that. But, I learned about this a couple years ago, and I've just been studying ever since. So we're going to go ahead and get into it. So cognitive warfare, like I said. So like I was just saying, similar to many related terms like memetics, which we'll talk about, cognitive warfare is said to have no persistent real definition in the field in which it is used. In other words, defense, the defense industry. Nevertheless, it is clear that it refers to a relatively distinct domain of warfare above those already known. For example, you might think of land, air, and sea or something like that, or even psychological operations or influence operations. Cognitive warfare is said to kind of contain both of those. So it's a domain of military operations encompassing psyops and psychological warfare and propaganda, but also influence weapons and influence operations, but also combining them in a way with other technologies to sort of create its own domain, or at least that's how it's discussed. So we'll see a little more of what I'm talking about with that. But this then you might consider to include things like brain-computer interfaces, or BCI, but just as well stuff like social engineering, which we just talked about, of course. So to think about this, I've included this chart, which we can zoom in on here. And it shows basically, this is from a paper that I'll include the source for later. But they're drawing it from, it says these are convergent technologies as defined by the U.S. Department of Defense in the ROCO and Bainbridge Report 2012. So you can probably look that up. Some of this stuff they started to pull down, I think, because people started talking about it, to be honest. But a lot of it, at least, is accessible on websites for NATO and a lot of other related type of websites. And I'll show you, again, some more sources related to that in a little bit. But this shows basically how these different sort of disciplines or fields all feed into each other. You can imagine them feeding into each other to form this sort of area that they're calling technologies that, might relate to cognitive warfare. So this includes nanotechnologies, biotechnologies, info technologies, and cogno-technologies, which that sounds complicated, but nanotechnologies, is these microscopic kind of chips and things like that that could be, I guess, potentially put in somebody's brain or used in some type of way, put out some type of signal, maybe even a camera, anything of that nature that might then, I guess, have an impact potentially on how someone thinks or their cognition. And this is a whole, again, domain of warfare that they're talking about here. And I'll remind you, this is used in documentation from NATO. So, like I said, there's a lot of stuff that people generally would relegate to, conspiracy theory. But like I just said, these are NATO documents. These are NATO documents that are accusing China. And, there's documents I found from the U.S. military that are, and obviously they're saying they don't represent their employers, but that are accusing the Palestinians of being the first people to invent cognitive warfare, or the Russians, right? Obviously, groups that the West and the U.S. and others have interest in demonizing, right? Or portraying themselves as enemies of. And we know that this framing itself may be part of some cognitive warfare effort, if we want to think about it. At least if you think about the interest that the U.S. might have. Of course, they're going to portray their enemies as being the people who are innovating this sort of step above type of warfare. I mean, you could look at a similar thing with guerrilla warfare, but that was a different sort of historical context. So maybe they were a step behind in that case, the U.S. military, that is, at least in the traditional telling of the story. But in this case, if we look at something like psychological operations and, counterinsurgency efforts, which overlap greatly with, of course, this concept of cognitive warfare, then it's pretty clear in U.S. history that these are, long-standing traditions. But cognitive warfare as a concept is something relatively new. But the things that are inside of it that fall underneath it, not so new in my personal opinion. And so, how do we know that? I think it's pretty obvious. Again, if cognitive warfare lies at the intersection of psychological warfare and influence operations and encompasses these technologies that might contribute to building a new domain for effecting thought control on targeted populations, there's countless examples where we could find the U.S. engaged in those kind of activities. So as I've noted elsewhere, this can be demonstrated with the various attempts at social engineering, which go back to American slavery and even before that, in England and all throughout history, as well as various counterinsurgency operations targeted at enemies engaged in guerrilla warfare, which again, go back throughout the centuries. Obviously includes COINTELPRO and things like that, at least in terms of how they framed it. There's some complication there, but that's a different topic, in terms of defining counterinsurgency. But these are all effectively foundational constructs in the development of what's being called cognitive warfare. This relates fundamentally to the study of political science then, at the level of the literature that we call the faces of power. So I'm gonna break that down for you real quick. The faces of power in, political science literature. And we're not gonna talk about, the readings and all that type of stuff. We could get into it someday, but I just wanna give you the concepts, what they really mean at the baseline in terms of how we should be thinking about them and why they matter to you. So the first face of power is a understanding of a kind of like first dimension of power, right? So it says this is where A influences B to do something they might not otherwise do. This is then going to be focused on observable behavior, which is why political scientists tend to focus on it, because again, like I talked about previously with the concept of empiricism, and positivism and these ideas of, you needing to be able to witness something and observe it or reproduce it so that scientists can really study it and potentially control it. For it to be scientific, this is limiting, in terms of the perspective that it gives us on all the phenomena going on in the world. But, of course, we can understand why they focus on that type of stuff. But in terms of an example of the first phase of power, you might want to think about like a town hall or something like that. So I mentioned, again, in another video, this guy, Robert Dahl, and he talks about the first phase of power, a lot in his book, Who Governs, I think it's called. But basically, or something like that. But anyway, like I said, I'm not going to talk about the readings, but, people who focus on this view essentially tend to view America as pretty democratic. So think about something like a town hall where, if you show up and you have a better argument than me and you win, that was some behavior that we can observe, and you might have influenced me to give up and stop trying to push my opinion because everybody else clapped or something like that, right? For you. That's one way. The second phase of power is called agenda setting, and this is also known as the mobilization of bias. So think about it. Agenda setting, you get to set the agenda on a political sort of, about in terms of what gets talked about basically, or what gets done, right? So that means you have control over the institutions in some way, or the social processes that, control the institutions or the politics basically. So you can think about it as A, being able to prevent B from participating in politics by taking away their rights, for example. So again, throughout American history, we could look at quote unquote non-Christians, which later became what we call white people, born in the colonies into slavery, or later became black people, but Christians being a reference to white people, being born as slaves forever, including their children, in terms of how it was written into the law. That's literally setting the agenda. Now you don't have rights, so you can't participate in it. So you don't get to act in politics. So that's a different kind of thing than this first dimension where you could have acted and you tried, you had the capability to, but you weren't allowed to, right? So again, this idea is sort of, you could think of it as propaganda for democracy, that, most of what happens in our politics happens on this first layer of, look, here's what you can see, this is where the politics is. As long as you look at that, they could probably convince you that it's fair, Once you look at the second layer where, things are actually going on in terms of, sort of what a lot of Marxists talk about, sort of owning literally means of production or means of basically information gathering and intelligence, knowledge making. This is important stuff, but you can go beyond that even to the third layer. And this is the one I think is the least talked about among political scientists, but it's talked about in other areas in my opinion. And this is known as simply thought control. And at least that's how I would term it, that's how others have talked about it. So it encompasses exactly what it sounds like, controlling how people think over time so as to prevent them from ever entering domains of power. And this is facilitated by feedback effects. So where two things feed into one another and keep producing effects over and over again. This is where we should see cognitive warfare as operating. This may also explain why political scientists tend to ignore it or pretend not to understand it or not hear of it in the first place, because it's really where these kind of covert or subterranean politics happen, which, a lot of times are going to be outside of this traditional realm of what you or I may refer to as politics. But people know that, I think, on a baseline level, despite what social scientists think about people being, like I said before, they think they're as dumb as Winnie the Pooh or whatever, right? The reality is, I think most people understand that there's a level of theaters to politics and that there's things going on behind the scenes, and the elites seem to undercount the degree to which that's the case, and elites therefore feed into the social science that gets produced and so on and so forth. But clearly, brainwashing, propaganda, intelligence operations, all this MK Ultra stuff, social engineering, all of that stuff is already going on. Social scientists participate in it. The military participates in it. Intelligence participates in it. Corporations participate in it when they advertise. And they may even have their own agendas at times. So in my opinion, and I'm biased, but it's my opinion, this is where a lot of politics is actually happening, is this sort of third layer of power. So third phase, third dimension, whatever you want to call it. So why should we care about that? Well, in terms of, how it relates to this, the specific framing of thought control, like I was saying, tells us precisely what cognitive warfare is really about. Cognition refers to the process of thinking, right? And especially thinking about where that's coming from in your brain, right? Consciousness, all that. Cognitive warfare is interested in engaging in innovation by any means necessary, basically, to hijack the thoughts of anybody framed as their enemies, or not even necessarily enemies, anybody who might be needing to be influenced in some way to acquire the outcome that you want. And this could be, at least in terms of how I've seen it discussed, literally anyone, including potentially politicians, without them knowing all kinds of things. Because you can imagine a conspiratorial logic to this, which I think is feasible, where somebody's plotting and they have a specific intention of how they want to program people. And that might look like, a covert outfit or something like that. Rogue faction of the CIA, rogue faction of the CIA that works with academics that they've selected, that they agree with, that are conservative or that are quote unquote progressive or whatever else, right? They might all scheme together. Or you could think of a sort of system approach to understanding this. And I think also this is viable as well, where essentially, maybe they're thinking about national security or something like that, or so-called. And the way that they've been told to understand in the military is one way. And they're trying to maintain a balance between things that may be apparently oppositional forces or whatever, and they might interfere in something that, maybe without letting superiors know, or, as superiors at a certain level or within a certain framing. There's all kinds of ways to think about this, but at the end of the day, what we should understand is this is going on all around us. This can happen during peacetime, and it often does happen during quote unquote peacetime, because the idea with a lot of this type of warfare is that you're not getting into war. You don't have to send your troops out. You could just infiltrate the enemy and with spies and gather intelligence and prevent wars, or get a better outcome than you might have got if you didn't go to war, if you went to actual conflict, right? Or you could change their population and, make it so the population overthrows the government that you don't like, which obviously, again, these are things we know our government has been engaged in. Even political scientists know that at a certain level, right? I've seen a paper about literally how many CIA overthrows there have been and sort of mapping those and stuff like that. There's limitations even to some of that kind of work, but people are aware of this stuff. It's just, like I've said before, it's kind of taboo. So that's why I'm putting it here. I want to tell people how it relates to them. But individual people on the internet are even part of this. Like, you don't have to be a government, you know what I mean? There are individuals with sock puppet accounts, so-called, you know what I mean, where you just make an account and pretend to be someone else, that are pushing propaganda toward their own, ends or beliefs, or they're being paid by other people to do that, or they're being paid to run bot farms to do that. And I'm not suggesting anybody go do that. It may even be illegal or whatever, but I'm just saying this is what's happening. And someone needs to talk about it. People need to be aware of it so that they can resist against it. So I think everybody, like I said, needs to know more about this. I'm not really an expert on any of this or cognitive warfare, but it's something I've, really tried to push my research toward, because I think it relates fundamentally to this history of Black America and colonization and the US really broadly. So in that sense, I've become an expert on certain aspects of relating to it, relating different dynamics of it. But, the specifics of cognitive warfare, I can't pretend to be an expert, but that's why I'm going to walk you through a couple of screenshots that I have from various readings that you can go and look up and look at yourself if you want to. Just search this stuff on Google. If you can't find it, let me know in the comments. Maybe we can figure out a way to find it. But for now, like I said, I'm gonna just help you run through some of it so we can see exactly what they're talking about, because it's right here in the open and it's very potent stuff. So the cognitive warfare concept. This is an article by Bernard Claverie and Francois de Cluzel. I want to say one of them is with NATO. I think that's de Cluzel, the Norfolk sort of Joint Command Center in NATO, and I think that's the only NATO command center in the U.S., but at least as far as I'm aware. But yeah, that's in Norfolk, Virginia, so the same kind of Hampton Roads area. And they're claiming, of course, that their views don't express or represent, the people they work for, because they have to say that. But obviously the people they work for are interested in what they're saying, so just keep that in mind. But they say cognitive warfare is now with us. The main challenge is that it is essentially invisible. All you see is its impact, and by then, it's often too late. So obviously that creates a problem for social scientists and other people trying to study this stuff, but I can tell you, you can look and try to see some of the places where you might be seeing this and what kind of outcomes you might expect to see when you would be seeing this versus another explanation for whatever you're seeing. And that would be a scientific way potentially to go about trying to observe some of this stuff. You can also just literally read these documents to see what are they doing, what do they suspect is going on. And that's the framework I'm trying to give you to help you see, what they might be doing to y'all on YouTube, on TikTok, on Twitter, all over the place. Obviously, this is where this stuff is most easily facilitated. But they go on to say it's now seen as its own domain in modern warfare, alongside the 4 military domains defined by their environment: land, maritime, air, and space, space, and a cyber domain that connects them all. Recent events that upset the geopolitical balance of power have shown how this new warfare domain has emerged and been put to use. It operates on a global stage since humankind as a whole is now digitally connected. It uses information technology, tools, machines, networks, and systems that come with it. So all tools, machines, networks, and systems, in my opinion, we need to be focusing on and learning about these things to see what they're looking at to potentially exploit against us, right? It says its target is clear: our intelligence, to be considered both individually and as a group. So what groups do they think you're a part of? That's one way they're targeting you. What type of individual do they think you are? That's one way they're potentially targeting you. Who has that information? Advertisers and all these big data companies that have collected it over time because they've been surveilling everybody through the data. Yeah, you already know. All right, this is another article about this. This is like a 5-page little kind of briefer, like magazine thing on it or something like that. But it says the 21st century game changer, cognitive warfare. Although most of the cognitive attacks remain below the threshold of armed conflict, the effects can be lethal and multi-domain, affecting all 5 domains of warfare. They go on. Victory will be defined more in terms of capturing the psychocultural rather than the geographical high ground. Understanding and empathy will be important weapons of war. And that's Major General Robert H. Scales, retired, PhD, U.S. Army War College, former commandant. I can zoom in on this real quick. Man. There's another one. Only 5 to 10% of the decisions we make are rational decisions. For the rest, we rely on our subconscious decision making, which is strongly influenced by repetition, automatisms, biases, and fallacies. And I'm going to talk about that automatism thing in another video, because that's an interesting, deep history, that concept on its own. Cognitive activities target the subconscious mind, which is always active. So that brings us back to this, these old school kind of psychology things. I mean, they talk about it sometimes because they're trying to get extra scientific now with it. But you have to remember there's an influence to these kind of Freud and Jungian, Carl Jung, like sort of beliefs about the subconscious mind at some level. That's where we want to look at, magic and the people that study magic, because they relate to some of that stuff more, because that talks about mythology and how you can use mythology essentially for cognitive warfare, right? people have used that for centuries, millennia, right? That's human history. That's what we do. It could be good or bad. Pretty much all of these technologies could be good or bad, right? But we got to know about them. Otherwise, they're going to use them against us without us knowing. They say emerging technologies. Those embryonic technologies are scientific discoveries that are expected to reach maturity in 2023 through 43 and are not used currently, or whose effects on alliance defense, security, and enterprise functions are not entirely clear. So I guess they're just defining that, but that's the time frame you want to look at for when this stuff is developing, at least in their mind. So these are recent developments, and that's according to NATO Science and Tech. Neural nanotechnology can be used to bring nano-sized robots close to a neuron via the bloodstream and make it possible to link human brain directly to a computer, making use of artificial intelligence in the process. Now, if you really get into these documents, you'll see they talk about super soldiers and all this stuff. And again, they make the claim that China's already doing this, and so we need to look into it for defense purposes. Again, of course, they're going to say that. Is that the truth? Probably not. They said the same thing about, so-called brainwashing, which they blamed on North Korea and Russia. And again, we know that's pretty much bullshit, but maybe there's a way that they were doing it, or maybe a way they were engaged in those things that was new to them at the time. That's one possibility for sure. But we just want to keep that in mind, because we don't want to think that they're not already doing this stuff. Because honestly, that would just be silly to take their word for it. This is another clipping from that same 5-pager. It's dense. It's got a lot of good information in it. But it says, in April 2013, U.S. President Obama announced the launch of the White House initiative, Brain Research Through Advancing Innovative Neurotechnologies, BRAIN. Its goal was to support innovation that would further our understanding of the brain. Russian commentators perceived it as a project to, quote, hack the human brain, which it is, pretty objectively, right? See that? How they tried to frame it, though. You just want to pay attention to these things. In 2016, Elon Musk started the neurotechnology company Neuralink, which aims to develop a brain-computer interface to extend the abilities of people with paralysis. Fair enough of a use, I guess, right? But of course, such an interface may also be used to extend the abilities of people without disabilities, for instance, to improve their performance on the battlefield. Future developments may include innovation in artificial intelligence, machine intelligence, and means to enhance human brain power either through alteration of genes, or directly by linking the brain through physical peripherals or anatomically internalized products. Some scary stuff, right? That relates to the whole transhumanism stuff that people talk about with the, people have their blood boys and all this type of stuff. They're taking their microdosing, to try to improve their brain power with nootropics and all this stuff. These are part of the same kind of trajectory, right? Sci-fi trajectory of where humanity is supposed to go according to them. And yeah, that just is what it is, I suppose. You don't have to go along with it, but you want to be aware of it. Cognitive Warfare by Stuart A. Green. This is a lieutenant, or he was a lieutenant at least in 2008, Master of Science of Strategic Intelligence. And I just found this on the net, right? So don't come at me, okay? And also, again, at the bottom, he says it doesn't express the views of the Department of Defense or the U.S. government. Take that with a grain of salt, because it may or may not, but he has to say that either way. But I'm not going to go through too much of that because it's a pretty disturbing paper, to be honest. But him in particular makes the accusation that Palestinians have basically invented this concept and innovated it. And, he talks about this claim that they're doing this Hollywood stuff. You hear Tucker Carlson make some of these kind of claims too. You hear a lot of these people make claims like that. And again, you want to be careful with this stuff because they will tell you something one way because that's the way they heard it. And that may be what they're being shown, or maybe a strategic intention that they have to gain a particular outcome. But you want to be aware of what their incentives are, and I'm reminding you that as someone studying politics, right? But just look at some of these, topics he talks about, quote unquote, jihadists inappropriately dismissed, meme plexes, memetics, endemic versus epidemic, what else he got? Types of jihad, who must participate in jihad, He's blaming this stuff on the Middle East. Hollywood, Hezbollah would, right? Like, come on. Moderate use of moderate memes, cognitive paralysis. Okay? Again, they're using memes for the purpose of warfare, right? Because this relates to psychological warfare. These are concepts. This is an interesting chapter, in terms of how he frames it. But you look at that. He's got this little chart here. Objective, support, supply, training, others, all this stuff. What else we got? So he's got these examples of memes he's providing, and this is actually from a different reading. This is from the Memetics Compendium. So you want to check this one out too. I just found this on the net as well. Just search it. You'll find it. Dr. Robert Finkelstein, May 2008. This joint is 1,000 pages, yo. Check it out. It's 1,000 pages on memetics, cognitive warfare, basically. Okay. It's still at the foundational level at this point in 2008, but they have an understanding already at that point of how to use memes for war. And you look on, on the internet, on these websites, Twitter, Reddit, all this stuff. Think about, they already knew this stuff. How some of the memes you were looking at back in the day that related to politics or related to stereotyping a group of people in some way or whatever might have been explicit attempts by somebody to get you on one side of things. And over time, especially putting this stuff in front of kids, it probably worked. You can see the effects of it today. And we could get into that, but not today. So yeah, Memetics Compendium, check that out. They know that they've been doing it. I want you for the U.S. Army. That's a meme. That's propaganda. U.S. Information Agency, right? And again, we can look at some of these. This is just the table of contents from this. But look at that. That's under 1,600 pages. And look at some of these titles. Evolution of Technology, Exposing Creative Design Myths. Are animal minds suitable habitats for memes? Darwinian processes and memes in architecture. They're trying to make a meme science, literally, right? This stuff, you can't say that doesn't relate to at least how some of these magicians and people that study magic and occult practices and stuff, they look at things the same way. So if you want to tell me this stuff doesn't relate, and there's a lot of people that will try to tell you this doesn't matter, and the magic and the occult stuff doesn't matter. Come on, just look at what these people are saying. They think it's important. You need to study your enemy, or at least the person who thinks they're your enemy, if you want to survive, right? And it makes you question whether some of these people are working for the people who it would be convenient for them if you didn't know about this stuff, right? So, like I said, NATO. It's another one. Francois de Clouzot. Okay? He's just going in on it, but you want to check that one out as well. And this is another interesting paper on basically the same concept. It says colonization of the mind, the means, roots, and global perils of U.S. cognitive warfare. And it's from the Jinhua Institute in China, September 2025. And this gives you an opposing view on cognitive warfare that looks at some of what the U.S. has done. And I thought, wow, what great timing. I was studying it around the same time. And then I get this opposing view that I could then go and compare with what I already seen, because I was having to come up with the opposing view on my own, right? Which is good, and we should all do that. But I read through this and I'm sitting there like, yeah, I know some of these names. Chapter 1, The Historical Facts of U.S. Colonization of the Mind. Hans Morgenthau, an American political scientist, believed that the most successful of imperialist policies it aims not at the conquest of territory or at the control of economic life, but at the conquest and control of the minds of men, ... So you can go on from there. You already know they're going in. You can look that up, find it. It's online for free. It's great information. And these are some of the sort of mechanisms they break down. They say, A, compulsory transformation. Due to the huge disparity in positions of power, a hegemonic power tends to use its hegemonic position to forcibly implant its values and concepts in target nations, while selectively eradicating the specific indigenous culture and ideology. This coercive mental restructuring often results in a serious identity crisis. Okay, identity crises are a weapon that we know from the last video and from previous examples have been used against Black people in the history of America to do counterinsurgency, do psychological warfare, right? Identity crises. You want to keep that in mind when you see some of this stuff going on the internet, all right? cultural aphasia, not feeling your culture. I assume that's what that means. I have to, y'all might have to check me and look that up. Ideological chaos. B, malicious manipulation. To achieve ideological domestication, the hegemonic power often casts aside morality and indoctrinates obedience, massively cultivates dependent factions, and shatters philosophical autonomy within target populations. C, covert infiltration. Sounds like the co-optation video I made, right? Its ideological and cultural exports are often packaged in what appear to be reasonable forms, such as advanced concepts or civilizational progress, to infiltrate and influence the cognition of targeted groups through cultural products, education systems, academic exchanges, and other concealed cultural or concealed channels. So, co-optation can happen not just to Black people and Irish people and whomever else, but every single one of you. Alright? And D, long-term erosion. Intellectual and cognitive shifts are gradual, incremental, Go find a paper. Go read it. Here it is again. Colonization of the mind. U.S. Cognitive warfare. China, they gave you a gift, right? And you should read them both, to be clear. Get both sides of it. But one side has a vested interest in telling you their version of events that most likely is not going to be consistent with the version of events that, you would come to if you had full information, right? So, but you take a look and figure it out for yourself based on your context. I'm not here to brainwash you, all right? That's why I'm telling you about this stuff. And this is the last one. This is another thing by this Robert Finkelstein dude, but it's called Tutorial Military Memetics. And that's from 2011. So this is a little more concentrated version of what he gave us with the 16,000 page one, right? But if you're a real reader, check that one out. Then you come back, check this one out. But notice Alexandria, VA, okay? We know what's there. Social Media for Defense Summit. Social Media for Defense. Just think about that. What could that mean, right? So that's really what I have as far as a sort of overview of cognitive warfare goes. You also probably want to check out some videos on this channel called Neutrality Studies. Now, I'm not promoting them. I don't know them. I don't really know what their real mission is about. They seem to be some European cats who, they're talking about the situation they have over there in terms of dealing with what's going on with NATO and the US and trying to come up with something that, I guess has to do with keeping some level of autonomy for the people as they see it, right? But this is still important information for us because they have a particular perspective and, it gives us more information, just like everything else we looked at. And there's some good information on there. So definitely check out their videos on cognitive warfare. Think about how it might relate to you. Sometimes they talk about how it might relate to you. But again, not promoting them. I don't know them dudes. But something I learned from them is, the German sort of translation of it. And you can find more things sometimes by searching for studies in German or in French or in languages that NATO might speak or that, someone else might speak that you might want to learn about, China, whoever, right? So, cognitive Kriegsführung. I don't know if I did that all right, but, a German person can let me know. My German teachers might be disappointed. Considering so much of this work is coming out of NATO, it's interesting to see Europeans interested in peace and neutrality and picking up on it. So obviously I was glad to see them talking about this topic. But the documents themselves really emphasize that the best defense against cognitive warfare is to know about this stuff, right? Know about the methods so you know what you're up against. They likewise talk about things like building up your creative thinking, your creativity, and also your rationality, because they're trying to exploit that. So even the logic with which you think can be exploited, literally by social media algorithms. They're trying to right now engineer the best ways to exploit you along those lines. So just keep that in mind, okay? And there's a lot that I can say on that, but we're just gonna have to leave that there. But I do want to talk about those things someday. And another thing I want to talk about is artificial intelligence, because this whole domain of information technology and just technology related to cognitive warfare and the best way to go about it is most likely going to rely on the advancements in artificial intelligence. And as you can see looking around, they are trying to use artificial intelligence, or at least unleashing it on people and letting them go crazy. And I mean, no offense by saying that. Clearly, I've gone to the edges myself, but really think about what this means. That's all I encourage. Again, what did they say? One of the best defenses against cognitive warfare is your own critical thinking, your own creativity, your own ability to kind of balance these things and see when people are manipulating. Now, if they're telling you that AI is alive, and that's the line they're selling you, and that it's going to take your job because it's better than you at the job, not because they want to get rid of you and they're coming up with the best excuse they can think of, they're engaged in their own kind of cognitive warfare already, arguably, So, again, AI is literally sapping your critical thinking, your creativity, and using it to build a net of artificial intelligence in a separate sort of realm, a digital realm of consciousness, a digital matrix of consciousness that they want to relegate you to. Basically a digital plantation. That's my perspective. Again, you can hear where my perspective seeps through, hopefully, but I do think that's the case. I think a lot of people think that's the case, and all I'm trying to do is really help y'all see so we can come up with some ways to deal with this and maybe keep some of our autonomy, fight back against some of this stuff, and do it in a way that, everybody can access it, or at least help other people access it, or whatever. So that's really all I have in terms of cognitive warfare for today. Appreciate y'all, and I will see you in the next video. Peace.